Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
All right. Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Ashley did a great job with the intro there. So just, yeah, to reiterate that, although this class is not for continuing education credit, it is a lot of good information. If you're a board member, if you're a property manager, if you're just somebody interested in the industry to learn more about the SIRS requirements and everything that's gone on these last couple of years, you're in the right place. Thanks to Campbell for giving us this opportunity. We've been doing a lot of continuing education stuff with Campbell over the years, and today is going to be a little bit of a departure from that in that sense that this is not officially for credit, but I think this is what people are interested to hear about. We've been getting a ton of questions every time we do have our continuing education classes, and so I thought let's just put together kind of a recap, sort of state of the market, state of the industry type thing for those folks who are confused or concerned or just curious about what's going on these days. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and our company, just a little bit more detail. So again, my name is Will Simons. The company is called Association Reserves. We've been in business now since 1986, and up to this point, we've completed more than 90,000 reserve studies, all different types of properties all around the world. I've been with the company since 2008, so I'm going on 17 years this year. I'm a credentialed reserve specialist. That's the RS after my name that you see there. That credential comes from CAI, which is the Community Associations Institute, if you're not familiar. CAI is a great organization. It's been around a long time and kind of a clearinghouse or information source for anything and everything really to do with the community association world. I've lived in condos and HOAs. I was on the board of my HOA for about 6 years. So those of you who are board members out there, welcome. I know what it's like to be in your shoes. I know that this can be a very difficult, thankless job, and I salute you guys for being here. Hopefully we'll give you some good information, some good content to take back to your communities. I guess on that note, today's material really is very specific to Florida condominiums and co-ops. So I don't want to dissuade anybody from joining. Everybody is welcome, but if you are part of an HOA, if you are outside of Florida, everything I'm going to talk about today really may not be as applicable to you as you might think. So this is going to focus specifically on these new requirements, which only apply to those types of properties. Okay. Let me brag about my team a little bit. So our Florida staff is the largest office that we have for association reserves in the country. We're up to 29 people now. We deal with thousands of properties all over Florida, like I mentioned, condos, HOAs, but also resorts, country clubs, timeshares, marinas, schools, all types of different facilities. I've got a lot of interesting people with very interesting backgrounds on our staff. Most of our staff have engineering degrees, but we've also got folks with architecture, construction management, business, accounting. We've got a bunch of us that have now reached the CAI RS credential, which I'll show on my next slide here, and a few more that are in the pipeline to get that in the next year or two. We're very, very grateful and proud of the fact that we've been awarded a Reader's Choice Award by the Florida Community Association Journal for the last 12 years in a row. So I think we're doing something right, and we want to keep that going. So today's class, again, I'm going to keep calling it a class, but it's not. It's a presentation. Really is just for information's sake. I'm going to try to get through the material in about 30, 40 minutes because I want to allow a lot of time for Q&A. So as Ashley said, you guys can go ahead and start hitting that Q&A button down at the bottom. Just as another illustration here, these are all the staff on my team specifically in Florida that have now earned that RS credential. So I want to give each one of them a shout out. We've got a lot of very capable people that are helping a lot of different communities out there. Speaking of those types of communities, I put this slide together just to show you kind of the breadth and the range of different properties that we work with. So each of these photos represents a different client for us. Up in the top left, we've got a private school facility down in Miami, lots of educational facilities, of course, but also sports complexes, cafeterias, administrative offices, all that kind of stuff. Top right, this is a very long-term client of ours. You may recognize this is Fisher Island. So we've been doing the Fisher Island Community Association studies, which is their master association that governs all of the roads and facilities and seawall and a lot of infrastructure type stuff out there on Fisher Island. Bottom left, we've got a golf and country club. So, this would be an example of a non-association client for us, but 18-hole golf courses, tennis facilities, spa facilities, all those types of things and more. And then bottom right, we've got a very relevant example for today's material, a nice luxury high-rise condo. We deal with a lot of condos all up and down the coasts of Florida. So those of you who are in a condo association, especially if you're subject to these SIRS requirements, we've dealt with a lot of properties just like yours, okay? So this is one other thing I wanted to highlight before we get into the actual material. We years ago developed an online software program that we call UPlanet, which is a very, very powerful tool. It gives our clients the ability to test out different scenarios. They can log in through our website and access all of their data. It's in a password protected account for them. They can do things like add and remove components. They could see what happens if you change a cost estimate or a life expectancy for a component. They could change things like interest and inflation rates, design a new funding plan, and just kind of see and model into the future what their budgeting choices may look like long term. So just wanted to highlight that's one of the many features and benefits of working with association reserves. So if you want to get any more information about our company, our website is reservestudy.com. Got a lot of great tools there on the homepage, including one where you can request a proposal. So if you're interested in that, I would invite you to go and check out our website. I'll have my email address up on screen at the end when we get to the Q&A as well. But I think that's enough for now. Let's talk about what we're going to get in today. So put together this real quick outline. The first thing I'm going to do is just refresh everybody. What is actually required? What are the SIRS requirements? And I'm going to abbreviate this all day. I'm going to just say SIRS, but that's an abbreviation for Structural Integrity Reserve Study. It's just kind of a mouthful. So again, we've done over 1,000 of these things. I think we have a really good data set showing averages and ranges and just kind of what has been our experience working with many, many different types of properties all over the state. Speaking of that, I will give you kind of the big picture, right? How many condos and co-ops are there in Florida? The third section, we're going to get into the nitty gritty. We're going to talk about what are the actual financial impacts to a lot of these communities. How much are these owners, being asked to increase the budget, right? Are there special assessments involved? I'm going to give you as many answers as I can, and then we'll talk about what's next, what might be changing in the near future. And yeah, this is very much a dynamic situation as we'll talk about, but let's get started with just a little bit of the background. So what is actually required? So I guess just for those who may not connect all the dots, if we go back to 2021, right, we had the terrible tragedy, Champlain Towers South condominiums collapsed in the middle of the night, and many people lost their lives. That turned into $1 billion legal claim. And so that was obviously a monumental impact to the community, to the state, to the whole condo association world as a whole. And what we got out of that pretty quickly, by the end of 2021 and certainly into early 2022, you have this legislative response that's taking place, where the Florida legislature is being tasked with this very difficult challenge, right? How do we prevent something like this from happening again? And so part of the response was to create these new requirements for different types of properties that meet certain criteria. So specifically what we're talking about with the SIRS requirement, this is for residential Florida condos and co-ops that are 3 or more stories in height. Okay, so if you are a office condominium or a medical office or something like that, the SIRS requirements don't actually apply to you. This is only for residential properties, but it is for condos and co-ops, right? The language for co-ops in the Florida statutes is almost identical to what it says for condos. So they usually get addressed together. And it's for buildings that are 3 or more stories in height. And specifically, that means residential buildings. So if you have any residential buildings on your property, even though you may be more of a townhome style development, if you are governed as a condominium or a co-op, these rules do apply to you, okay? So the part that I put here about that being regardless of the property's age or the location, that's an important distinction. So early on in this process, the first legislative bill that we got was Senate Bill 4D. And in addition to the SIRS, it also created a new requirement for something called a milestone inspection. So a milestone inspection, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail on those because that's not the subject of the material today. But the milestone inspection was meant for older properties. Initially, it was 30 years or more, or maybe 25 years or older if you were on the coast. Put all that aside for today's discussion. What I'm talking about applies to all condos and co-ops, regardless of whether you're on the coast or inland, regardless of the age of the property. So even brand new buildings, when they turn over from a developer, need to have a SIRS done. So the point is that a SIRS, a reserve study, is a financial planning exercise. And you want to start financial planning for your property as early as possible. So upon turnover, certainly within the first few years of the building's, life expectancy, that is when you want to start diverting a healthy amount of money into that reserve fund so that you don't have to play catch up later on. All right, so we got Senate Bill 4D in 2022. In 2023, we had Senate Bill 154, which continued on with this legislative requirement, made some adjustments to what needs to be done there, which we'll talk about. But all along, the deadline for compliance was the same. So the deadline's now passed. That's why I put it in red. December 31st, 2024 was the deadline by which these Florida condos and co-ops were supposed to have this done. Now, if you're sitting there on the other side of the screen thinking we didn't get it done, you're not alone, but that was a deadline that was supposed to be observed. And there may be some issues for you going forward if you don't have a plan in place to comply with it as soon as possible. So Senate Bill 154 did specify the items that need to be included in this analysis, right? So those who might have taken my classes before hopefully remember that any type of reserve study begins with a physical analysis and then is paired with a financial analysis of the property. So SB 154 clarified the list of components, the list of things that belong in this physical analysis. It has to be done based on a visual inspection. So that visual inspection of the property can be done by a licensed architect, engineer, reserve specialist, or a PRA, which is another industry credential, which comes from a group called APRA. But you have to have somebody with the right qualifications to do the physical inspection. I want to reiterate, it does require that visual physical inspection. I've heard a couple of rumors out there saying that there's maybe some providers who are alleging that a SIRS can be done without a visit to the property. That's not true, right? So if you have had a SIRS done by somebody who never even came out to your property, that will not meet the requirement, right? Maybe if there was an inspection done the year prior, if they had come out there and done a milestone or done some other, conventional reserve study and they were doing an update to it, that may qualify. But if you have not had your building inspected, then that is not a SIRS. Okay. Speaking of the things that have to be included here, I put this slide up just to run through those requirements again. So some of these are pretty obvious, right? Roof replacement is obviously something that buildings should be saving money for. Some of the other things on this list, though, are a little bit more subjective. Okay, so I'm going to highlight 3 of them in particular, which is the structure, the plumbing, and the electrical systems. These are things that are typically not fully replaced at a property. Okay. And you could even say the same for some fireproofing and fire protection elements. But when we look at something like the structure, okay, those that may be familiar with the original legislation, Senate Bill 4D, before it just said structure, it actually called out foundations and load-bearing walls. And a lot of us in the industry looked at that and said, well, these are not things that most properties will ever need to concern themselves with. They are meant to last the life of the building. So when they updated this and created Senate Bill 154, fortunately, they removed some of that language and just put in structure. So in reality, what this means for most condos, especially those on the beach, is allowances for structural repairs, concrete restoration, right? If you've got columns in your parking garage that need repair, if you have a foundation issue, right, a foundation that's settling, that needs to be repaired. Those are all types of structural problems that you may need to fund for in your SIRS, but we're not talking about completely replacing the structure, the bones of your building, okay? Plumbing and electrical are also things that, especially for newer properties or younger properties, don't need to worry about very much. So this is not meant to be a full-scale repiping of your building or replacement of all of your electrical systems. That may be required in some extreme cases, maybe a very old property or a construction defect that has just demanded that you need to replace things like that. But in most cases, the interpretation here is going to be allowances for repairs, particularly as a building ages. But we're not talking about completely replacing some of these things. Other ones, maybe yes, right? You do need to paint and waterproof the exterior of your property in its entirety. Windows and doors here was something that a lot of people highlighted. So I want to clarify what that means. When we're talking about windows and doors, this is limited only to windows and doors that the association is responsible for. So in my experience, 90+% of the time, the individual unit owners are responsible for their windows and doors at their units. So if that's the case in your property, we're only going to include funding for things like maybe lobbies, amenity rooms, a gym, wherever you might have windows and doors that are in the common area, okay? So this is kind of the starting point. Obviously, this is not the comprehensive financial plan that your entire building will need. So I wanted to make that point that these SIRS items, these SIRS components, are a subset of all of the components of a property. Okay, so Florida Statute 718 and 719 predated these SIRS requirements, and they specify that condos and co-ops need to fund reserves for roofing, painting, pavement, and anything over $10,000, right? So that's a much broader list. Now you're talking about elevators, cooling towers, parking lots, swimming pools, gym equipment, hallway carpeting, right? All of the different things that associations should be reserving for exist still within the statute. The SIRS are just a structural kind of subset, so a little concentric circle within the totality of all reserve funding components, okay? So that's kind of the physical side. Now the financial requirements of these SIRS are something we also need to address. So up until now, if your property has had one pooled reserve account, right? You have one pool of funds that was up until this point used for paying for all of your reserve obligations. You now need to split that pool into two pools, right? What we are calling your SIRS components, and then your non-SIRS, or maybe your general reserves. The logic there is that the state has now said you cannot use money that was meant for something structural, like a roof replacement, and use that money to remodel your lobby. Okay, so that's kind of the logical test we need to apply. That means we're splitting your account balance appropriately into these two categories. Probably going to prioritize the SIRS obligations first. If there's money left over, or if there's a big need for something on the non-structural side, then we will park some money in that pool as well. All right, so just conceptually imagine one pool of funds splitting into two. At minimum, when you are funding a reserve account, you need to do what's called baseline funding. It means that as you project forward, and in our studies, we do a 30-year cash flow analysis. As we look out over those 30 years, we're showing cash going into the pool, cash coming out of the pool. At minimum, we need to make sure that there's never going below zero, right? So that's an exercise we do on the computer. We look at the timeline of costs we've laid out, which are based on the underlying estimates for life expectancy and replacement cost. We set these targets along the way in time. So we're going to design a funding plan that makes sure that we have enough money going into reserves to pay for those things, such that after you pay for them, you're not completely draining the account. That's called baseline funding. Okay, so two things that are going to be true from now on, which are these bottom two here. So for any budget adopted in 2025, right? So any budget, really it's after December 31st of 24. So from now on at your association, you may not waive or partially fund reserves for those structural components, those 8 or 10 things I just had on the list a few slides ago. Those are mandatory to be funded now. There is no ability to waive them. For your other components, okay, the gym equipment, the lobby, the pool furniture, even things like the elevator, the cooling tower, you still can waive or partially fund reserves for those, but the voting threshold to do that is now higher, okay? So it used to be typically that a majority of a quorum of owners would be enough to carry that vote, right? If you had 100 people in a building, but 35 owners show up to a meeting and that constitutes a quorum, then maybe it's just a majority of those people at the meeting can carry that vote. Not anymore. Now it is, in that example, 51 out of 100 voting interests would have to vote to waive or partially fund reserves for your non-structural items. Okay. All right, so that was just a fairly brief recap. I mean, there's more detail we can get into in the Q&A if you guys have more specific questions there, but let me zoom out and give you kind of the big picture of everything that's going on around the state. So in the state of Florida, according to public information, which I would suspect is maybe underreported a little bit, but according to the DBPR, as of last month, there's about 25,000 condo associations in the state, 712 co-ops. Again, I think the real number is a little bit higher than that, but let's just say, for argument's sake, roughly 25,000, 26,000 properties are in total out there. Now, the next question is, how many of those would be subject to these requirements? So remember, that's only the buildings that are 3 stories and above. Back in 2022, when Senate Bill 4D passed, one of the requirements they created there was this building reporting database. And the idea there was that condos and co-ops were supposed to go online, self-report, hey, here we are, we have buildings that are 3 stories and above, so that the state could get an accurate portrayal of how many properties would be subject to this new law. According to the building reporting database, only about 12,000 condos volunteered their information to say we are 3 stories and above. Now, I think that's very low. Just intuitively, if we think about condominium construction, it's vertical construction designed to maximize the amount of people on a piece of land. I would argue that the majority of condos are probably 3 stories and above, but only about 49% self-identified that way. Couldn't find any data at all about co-ops. Okay, so we don't know what is the percentage of co-ops that are 3 stories and above, but let's say it's probably a majority there as well. My point on the middle kind of red slide there, I don't think that this data is necessarily reliable. So instead, what I did is I looked at our database. What do I know for sure? Well, we've got thousands of Florida properties in our database that we've either worked with or sent proposals to. I looked at the percentage of those that are 3 stories and above, and it was more like 63%, maybe, close to 2/3, let's say. So if we take that approach, right, if we assume that that extrapolates out to the rest of the state, I think you could argue that there's probably more like 16,000 or more associations, condos and co-ops out there that were supposed to get this done. All right. So if you're wondering how many actually did, here's the number there, right? Again, according to the DBPR's reporting site, 4,300 condos and only 69 co-ops had certified or had signed off that they got this process done. So maybe a quarter to a third or so of the market that was supposed to meet the deadline actually did. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's just a huge volume of properties out there, not enough providers who are actually capable and qualified to do this work. I know in our case, and I think a lot of other companies' cases, we got booked up very early last year, and we effectively had to stop taking on new clients for a certain number of months. That's now subsided. We are taking on a lot of new work now, and I assume others are as well. But that was just an unfortunate math problem, right? I think there was just too many properties and too little time to get this done. But that doesn't mean they're absolved of this requirement, right? So I'm going to show up on the screen a little bit later what the language in the law says if you have not met that requirement. But before we get to that, I think we'll start talking about the actual data. What did we observe in doing all of these studies? And again, this is not a pure cross-section of the whole state. This is going to be limited to our experience with our clients, many of whom had been doing reserve studies, had been funding reserves prior to this point. But I think the takeaways here tell a story. All right, so the very first thing that we did when we kind of sat down at the beginning of this year and wanted to look at our experience so far was we split our clients, our list of properties, into two categories. And the first category were ones that have been funding their reserves up to now. The second was those that have not been funding their reserves. Okay, so these are kind of the A students, here are the people that have been doing a good job of this so far. So what I've got on the screen right now are the averages from these, large pool of studies. So on average, and I broke everything down to per unit per month because I think that's the most tangible dollar amounts that people probably care about. So when we looked at these properties, we saw that on average, they were putting away about $197 per unit per month into their reserves up until this point. Now, when we came along and did their SIRS for them, I want to make it clear, we actually did two studies. We did their SIRS and also their non-structural, their general reserve analysis. So we're doing two documents, two sets of recommendations for the same property. So that's what I mean here when I say these are the combined recommendations. So when we went through our process, we did our whole physical financial analysis, we delivered the outcome. On average, that recommendation for the SIRS and the non-SIRS together was about $294 per unit per month. So about a $97 a month increase on average. Okay. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not a backbreaking number for most associations and most people. This should be something that you can attain, especially when you look at the upside, right? This is the cost of living in an association. This is the cost of reinvesting in the property and making sure that your property value is protected for the long term. Okay, so about a $97 per unit per month increase is what we saw as a result of doing these SIRS. If we narrowed this down, right? If we recognize that, hey, look, client, you have the option to waive reserves for the non-structural elements. So if you choose to do that, if your owners choose to do that, we can remove all the non-structural requirement from the analysis. If we're looking at the SIRS only, that typical recommendation was about $183, $184 per unit per month. Actually a decrease of about 13 bucks compared to what they had been doing up to now. Okay, so that's an interesting takeaway. I don't think that would ever be a good idea. We'd certainly recommend that you fund reserves for all of your components, whether they're SIRS or not. But there are some cases where associations could be complying with the law and actually reducing their monthly budgets. Okay, now for the second group, right? Those that have not been funding their reserves up to now. Okay, by definition, they're putting away zero. They have no reserve money going in. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't have any cash on hand, but they are not actively budgeting for reserves in their most recent budgets. We come along, do our analysis, and on average, our combined recommendations are about $331 per unit per month. So that would be a net increase, right? If they're not funding now, and we're coming along with this number, with this combined number, that is a measurable, probably a little bit painful increase, okay? If we went through the same exercise and said, look, you can waive reserves for the non-structural stuff, then you could knock it down a little bit, right? It would be about $200 per unit per month that you need to be funding going forward, which you cannot waive, okay? Now, unfortunately, part of the story here is that some of these buildings needed to have special assessments. Now, I would argue that a special assessment is very rarely a surprise. It's the inevitable result of not having funded your reserves in the past. So if you're in an older building that has been waiving reserves or things have just, you've fallen behind, right? And you've got these big projects that need to be done and you're running out of time to collect that money, that's when a special assessment gets triggered. What we found is that the buildings that have been funding their reserves, about 19% of the time, right, about a fifth of the time, we were recommending a special assessment for their SIRS. Either that, or they already had one approved and in effect that we were just documenting, okay? So that's another thing. A lot of these buildings already knew they were going to have a special assessment. The SIRS did not do anything to change that. It just illuminated that. When we factor in the structural and non-structural elements, it was about a third of the time, 34% of the time, we're recommending some type of special assessment. Now, the dollar amounts for those assessments can vary dramatically. Some of these might have been $500 a unit, some of them 1,000, 1,500, 5,000. On average, they were a little bit painful, close to $10,000 per unit per unit for these assessments. Without reserves, okay, the buildings that have not been funding up until this point, we found what we expected to find. More often, they needed special assessments, 43% of the time for their SIRS, 62% of the time when you factor in the non-structural elements as well. And on average, those dollar amounts were higher, about 11,500, 11,529 per unit. So what does this mean? Okay, I think you could look at it as a glass half full or a glass half empty. I think that if you have reserves now or have been funding this, you had a vast majority of the time that there was no special assessment at all. And as we saw on the prior slide, on average, about $100 more per unit per month. Were there outlier cases? Absolutely. There are some buildings out there that have a ton of money to spend. They've got a lot of major projects that are due either immediately or in the very short term, and they needed special assessments. But let me stop right there for a second and point out that probably would have been true no matter what. I think in a world where the towers never collapse, the Champlain Tower South never collapses, and there's no legislation that got drafted as a result, all of those same buildings would have been going through the normal aging and deterioration processes, right? It's Mother Nature and Father Time that are the cause of these special assessments. It's deterioration of assets that need to be replaced. It is totally misguided, I think, to place blame with the legislature or on the law itself for the cost of living in an association. This is just normalizing it. It's spreading it out. It's illuminating the fact that if you don't have reserves, you will have to pay for these things with a loan or a special assessment. And that's hopefully something that people would want to avoid. Okay. So what's next? Let's talk about kind of the state of things now and where I expect that they may be going in the near future. So we did get another piece of legislation last summer. It was House Bill 1021, which required some reporting of these SIRS. Okay, so within 45 days of receipt, these properties are supposed to do two things. One, you're supposed to go online or to initially, I think it was sending an email to the Florida Condo Division saying, hey, we have completed it. More recently, they've created a website. So now you can go online, input your association's information, upload a copy of that study, and you have satisfied that part of the requirement, right? So there is this public reporting process. Secondly, there's the internal reporting process, making that study available to your ownership, all right? And I would argue that this could extend beyond just providing copies to your owners. These days, we're getting a lot of reports that insurance companies, lenders, folks like that are interested to see these SIRS before they do business with a condo property, because it's painting a financial picture that they are curious to know about. So that's another outcome of the SIRS requirement is bringing to light the financial picture of these properties and making that more available to more people so that they can make better business decisions about how they want to engage. Okay, so I kind of alluded to this earlier. We've gotten a lot of questions from clients and other people saying, well, what if we don't, right? What if we didn't meet the deadline, or what if we are just going to kind of hang back and see what happens? Well, this is what's written into the law. It says that if the board of directors willfully and knowingly fails to complete the SIRS by the deadline that's now already passed, that failure is a breach of fiduciary duty to the association, okay? So if you're a board member out there and you guys have not done your SIRS, a resident could flag that and say, look, I think that my board didn't do this. And you'd have to make the case that, was that a willful and knowing failure to complete that? And that can all have lots of downstream effects. If you're in breach of fiduciary duty as a board member, typically your directors and officers coverage won't protect you from personal liability. So it's something that you want to take seriously there. Again, you're not alone. As we showed, maybe a quarter to a third of the buildings that were supposed to do it actually did. But if I was a board member out there, I would be paying very close attention to this language. This goes on to state what happens to buildings now, right? So if you are in a condo that has units for sale, any contract that goes, or excuse me, any deal that's going to go into contract for somebody buying a unit in your property as of now, if you have not done the SIRS, there's a required statement that says this property was supposed to have this done, and this applies to milestones as well, and it has not done it, right? So if you are a lender who's going to issue a mortgage to a potential buyer and you get this language, that may kill the deal, right? So the big picture is that this can have a dampening effect on property values in these properties if you are not in compliance with the law and you're getting documents like this that bring that to people's attention. So let's move on. Very recently, just within the last 2 weeks, there was a new House bill proposed by Representative Vicky Lopez out of Miami, House Bill 913. So in terms of teeth to this law, okay, I think this is the most impactful thing that I've seen so far, which is to say that if you are a property that is insured by citizens, if you have not met your requirement to do your SIRS and your milestone, if you have to do the milestone, you may lose your coverage, okay? Now, I was, out of curiosity, looking to see, well, how many properties are actually insured by citizens? It's a lot. As of June of last year, I think 37% of all the condos in the state are with citizens. So it stands to reason there are quite a few properties out there that may be at risk of losing their property insurance coverage if they do not meet these requirements, okay? So again, you may have gotten proposals to do it. Your SIRS may be underway. But I'm trying to give everybody kind of a warning now that if this bill goes through, a lot of people, a lot of properties may lose their insurance coverage by not having met the requirement. Okay, just a few more slides and then we're going to wrap this up and go to the Q&A. So I see a lot of questions being asked. That's great. I'll get through as many of those as I can, but I just wanted to kind of give you some final thoughts here. So again, people asking, what if we didn't meet the deadline? And what if we just kind of wait, sit on our hands and see what happens? Well, the Florida legislature got back into session today. So from now through May, they're going to be hashing out what's being called now Condo 4.0, right? Further possible adjustments to this requirement. Talked about House Bill 913. Just within the last several days, we got a new bill that's on the Senate side, which is Senate Bill 1742, which has its own, changes and amendments to the law, right? So there is certainly legislative action being taken right now that may have impacts. Maybe there's an extension to the deadline. I know that's part of the SB 1742 language. But the point is, if you haven't gotten this done, it's time to act now, because I don't think they're going to give a whole lot of grace to properties that didn't do it. We're also seeing that on the private side. So private insurance companies, lenders, again, they are paying a lot more attention to condos now than they used to, I would argue. It may be hard to get insurance coverage elsewhere. It may be hard to get mortgages for properties in your, for units in your property if you have not met these requirements. Bottom line, I think it's also the right thing to do. I think let's not lose sight of the fact that relying on special assessments for what are otherwise very predictable routine projects is not a healthy way to go. Okay, those that have listened in my other courses over the years, you may remember what I've said many times. Florida is the only state in the country where the membership of an association ever had the option to waive reserve funding. So for me, this legislation is kind of closing a loophole that existed for a long time that allowed associations legally to kind of dig themselves into a financial hole, right? The owners in a lot of these properties have been enjoying budgets that were artificially low, that did not represent the true cost of ownership for living there. And this is going to change now. This is probably going to be painful for a short period of time. I think eventually, when the cost of ownership is kind of permeating through the market and everybody understands that when you live in a condo, you do need to put money away for paying for the common areas, that will normalize things, okay? I've been doing reserve studies in Florida for a long time, and I feel like over the years there was a penalty that some associations paid for trying to do the right thing. 5 years ago, if you were funding your reserves and another building down the street was not, and you had a potential buyer who's looking at the two buildings, they may look at the building that has the higher budget that is funding their reserves and kind of look away from that and be more attracted to go to the place where their monthly fee is going to be lower. But too often people didn't realize the other shoe is going to drop there. Okay, if they're not funding the reserves, there's probably going to be a special assessment. And if the argument is, well, hey, our owners can't afford this, they can't afford that $100 per month increase in the budget, my counter argument is, how would those very same people be able to afford a special assessment or to pay back a loan over a long period of time? Okay, there is no other option. So, I think that people saying that this is going to put people out on the street, I don't see that happening. As I've shown here, the averages are really not that impactful. And if the same buildings were going through the same projects and having to pay special assessments, I don't see how those same people could afford those either, which again is unfortunate. But when we look at the economic reality, you look at the responsibility that the board has, the fiduciary duty to maintain the property, that is very different from them trying to just keep the budget low for the sake of the owners. Okay, your association board has an obligation to fulfill that fiduciary duty, which means taking care of the property financially. Okay. So what I've been telling people is time to make adjustments, time to communicate this new reality. There is no more option as of now to waive reserves for these SIRS components. You still can for the other things, right? Let's not lose sight of that. If you're absolutely strapped for cash, one thing you can do is get 51% of your owners to vote not to fund reserves for your non-structural elements. Again, that doesn't make them go away. You will have to fund for those things in some other fashion. Communicating with residents is part of our job. That's why I'm doing this here today. And I hope that this might be useful information for some of you to carry on out into your circles. And I think the last part here, I want to end on a high note. Let's embrace the positives, right? If you are funding reserves properly, you will not be hit with those special assessments. It might take a period of time to adjust to that. But these, periodic surprises, these nasty surprises people were getting, finding out, hey, we never had money for this thing, and now we're being forced to cough it up. And I just moved here, and somebody else who lived here for the last 20 years got all the use and benefit out of these assets. Now I'm being forced to pay for them. That's bad for property value. So let's embrace the positive as an industry, that this is the right thing for associations to be doing. As the numbers show, hopefully it's not that big a deal, right? The majority of the time, they're not needing special assessments if they have funded reserves. When they have had those increases to the monthly budget, it's a manageable number, okay? So my last thought here is, that I don't think the sky is falling. I'm sure there are individual circumstances that are more difficult, and I don't want to make light of that or disregard that. It is the unfortunate financial reality that some people may not be able to afford living in their particular building. But again, I don't think that's the cause or the result of the legislation. I think that would have become true one way or another eventually. All that the new laws are doing now is normalizing this, making it consistent across the market. And I think that eventually Florida will come out the other side of this just fine. So that is the end of the material. I know we've got a lot of Q&A here. Ashley, I don't know if you wanted to go ahead and launch that poll now, but I'll start reading through.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and launch the poll right now. So if anyone does have to jump off, they can. But please go ahead and take the poll for us before you have to jump off. Will is going to do some Q&A now. But just if you do have to go, I will be sending out the presentation, the video recording, Will's contact information, and then also information on our future courses after.
Thank you very much. All right, so I've got my email address up on screen. Like Ashley said, she's going to send out my contact information. So please feel free to reach out if I didn't get to your question. I'm going to go for at least 15-20 minutes. I'm going to try to run through as many of these questions as I can. I'll qualify this in the beginning by saying I'm not an attorney, so don't take this as legal advice. If you're unsure, certainly consult with your own counsel. I've also never seen these questions before, so I might have to kind of read through them once or twice to try to get your answer, but I'm going to do my best, and I appreciate you guys hanging out with us. So, all right. The first question is the ratio of SIRS that inspected the entire property versus the percentage of the property resulting in more inspections needing to be done. I'm not sure if I have the answer to that. There's certainly some, if I'm understanding the question correctly, there's going to be some providers out there that only did their SIRS elements and did not do everything else. So if you're in one of those properties where they only went for those 8 or so items on the list, you need to start thinking about, what are my plans for replacing my elevators? It's probably the biggest one. My cooling tower, okay, my domestic water pump system, my amenities, right? There's actually, in most cases, a lot more non-structural elements that we see than there are structural, just by volume of components. Okay. Next one up here is, can the condo owners vote to remove the windows from the SIRS, shifting the ownership of the windows from the condo to the owners? Well, again, most of the time, the condo declarations do already state that the owners are responsible for their windows and doors. So if you're in a rare situation where the building is responsible for everything, for all windows, all sliding glass doors everywhere in the property, maybe you could go through that process to shift the declaration and transfer the responsibility to the owners. I think that would be a tough ask, but I guess it could be done. Anytime you're talking about changing documents, that's certainly a legal question. You'd have to get legal counsel involved for that. But yeah, look into that and maybe you'll find an answer there. All right, you go back up to the top here. Question here, can we post our SIRS on our website for owners to access instead of mailing it out and let them know it is available on the website? I think so. I believe that is an option for you. Yeah, I don't think you have to print out hundreds of pages and mail them to each owner, but that's something you'd have to clarify just with your probably with your attorney, just to make sure you're going through that. I think what the state cares about is that the owners get access to the information. So if you have a website with a password protected login and owners can go in and access documents through there, my intuition is that would be fine, but I would double check that. All right. Okay, why is painting a SIRS asset? Why is repairing the walkways a SIRS asset? Well, painting and waterproofing, again, was listed by the Florida legislature as one of the components that need to be included. Now, the reason why is because painting and waterproofing protects the exterior building envelope from deterioration, right? If you have a property that's concrete construction, that's exposed to the elements, that is not waterproofed, that will lead to structural problems, right? The most common areas we see this would be on, balconies and catwalk decks, which is kind of your second question there. If the failure to maintain things causes structural problems in the beginning, then by definition, that is a structural concern. So painting and waterproofing, repairing walkways, which could mean, resurfacing them, putting down a new deck membrane, waterproofing beneath tiles, even replacing balcony or walkway railings. Those are all structural elements in the sense that if they're neglected, they can cause greater problems. All right. What percentage of SIRS includes seawalls for the associations that have them? So I don't have an exact percentage. The answer would be, is the seawall a structural concern, right? So let's just imagine you've got a high-rise building and 10 feet of walkway and then a seawall. You could argue that seawall is part of what's holding up the building, right? If that seawall were to collapse and destabilize the foundation for whatever reason, then by that virtue, it is a structural element and should be treated that way. If you've got a much longer distance, right? Let's say you've got 150 feet from the footprint of your building to, a grassy area and then a seawall way out on the waterfront, the failure of that seawall probably won't have the same potential concern. So this is a case-by-case basis. You may have to get a structural engineer to give you a professional opinion on that. Is our seawall part of our overall structure? If the failure of this seawall would cause other problems, that's kind of the logical test you need to apply there. But I don't have a percentage to associate with that of how often that might be the case. Okay. Here we go. What are the SIRS requirements for a multi-condominium association comprised of 4 4-story buildings and 25 2-story buildings? And then the question says each building has a separate declaration of condo. Okay, so what you said there at the end is very important. If each building represents its own separate entity, right? Got its own budget, its own balance sheet, its own declaration, then I would say that only the ones that are above 3 stories need to have a SIRS done. Those 25 2-story buildings would, to my knowledge, be exempt from the SIRS requirement because they don't meet the height criteria. But that is only true given the question that this is a multi-condo association. If you have one association that's a blanket entity that includes 2 and 3 and 4 and 5-story buildings, because it's all one association, one financial entity, then I would argue that you should treat the entire property as needing the SIRS, especially if you're going to do things like roof replacements, building painting to all of the buildings there at once. That would need to be something that you would think through. But in your question, if it's a multi-condo, each building is separate, then I would say you only need to worry about the ones that are 3 stories or above. All right, here we go. My neighbor sub association president did not understand the SIRS requirements, so she had a reserve study done first and then a milestone inspection afterwards. She's still waiting on the report for the milestone. How should she handle making sure her reserves match up to the milestone report? I assume she should give the milestone report to the reserve study provider to update that accordingly. I haven't heard of any one department, et cetera, that will ask for our financials, including reserves. Will there ever be someone asking for this? Well, yes, the DBPR is going to be where you need to report that. So they're going to be going through that list of buildings that were originally identified in their database, comparing against the ones that didn't get the SIRS. And at a certain point, you may be getting a letter. You may hear from somebody saying, hey, where is your SIRS? We've been hearing this from insurance companies as well, right? When they're coming up for renewal, part of the criteria for renewing the policy might be reviewing to see if the SIRS has been done. So the first part of the question, if you've had a milestone done and you want to use that to inform the SIRS, I do think that's a good idea, right? If you've had an engineering firm come out and do a detailed milestone inspection, identify any structural concerns there, absolutely, I would think your SIRS should reflect that. So if you've already got one and you're waiting on the other, make sure that those documents are consistent with each other at the end of the day. But to the point about will there be somebody asking for this, I would say yes. If they haven't already, the state may be reviewing these records and reaching out to folks that haven't done it. Okay, here we go. If an engineering firm is making adjustments to their draft reports, when are the reports considered final in a multi-condo association? I don't know of anything in the law that speaks to that. It is very normal and natural for a reserve study or other types of reports to go through a couple iterations. When we send one off, client takes a look at that, basically need to be reviewed, right? If we come up with a number, we say, hey, your roof got replaced in 2020, and they go back through their building records and say, oh, you know what, it was actually 2018. Well, that's an appropriate thing to adjust. So in that sense, I would say you want to wait until your provider, I guess, has made that determination that, hey, we've been through the review process, everything is now final. Let's go ahead and call that the official document. Okay, here we go. Yes, so some people asking if this qualifies for continuing education credit. I'm sorry to say it does not. This is only for information. We may go through the process of trying to get this qualified for credit, but because some of the content is so new, I haven't had a chance to do that yet. So this is just for information's sake today. Let's see. Okay, good question here. Describe plumbing. Some think that the plumbing includes replacement of toilets and showers in the main building, such as in the lobby restrooms. There's nothing, unfortunately, in the statute to clarify what they meant there. Our interpretation is plumbing should be the supply and wastewater lines, right? Not every fixture, every tap, every shut-off valve. There's nothing to my knowledge that would require us to treat it that way. That would be over and above, I think, the intent of the law. As an aside, we do typically include bathroom remodeling as a non-structural component. So we do think of that as something that you should be saving money for. But with regard to the SIRS legislation, it's one word. It just says plumbing. So for me, it's kind of the distribution, the infrastructure of the plumbing, not every last fixture in the property. Let's see. You guys are asking a lot of good questions. What I'm trying to do now is be mindful of time and look over the ones that I think are the most useful to the most amount of people. Okay. Here we go. We split the reserves. Okay, so I'm guessing that means split between structural and non-structural. But can we use non-SIRS to fund SIRS, especially if we are presently short in the SIRS requirement? Yes. So 2 pools. You have your structural pool, your non-structural. Think of it as a door that only swings one way, right? If you have money that you were saving for your lobby and you now want to use that to pay for some concrete restoration, that's fine. You can use that that non-structural money to pay for a structural element. Cannot go the other way, right? So you cannot use structural reserve money to pay for a non-structural event. So that's the clearest way to articulate that, I think. Couple questions or comments in here about elevators. Yes, you know, a lot of people are finding that elevators are incredibly pricey. Yeah, modernizing elevators can be hundreds of thousands of dollars per elevator. It is not considered a SIRS asset. There's a comment here about one of the senators involved maybe being in favor of recategorizing that. Nothing official to that extent has happened to my knowledge, but yeah, I think that's the bigger point here, is that you absolutely need to have funds in place for everything at your property, right? Elevators do have a very predictable timeline. They're very expensive. You should be diverting money to pay for that one day and not getting hit with that big special assessment. So yes, they're just because we have a SIRS list, it does not mean that that is the most costly or most important things at any given property. All right. Okay, let's see. All right, this is a good question. Our SIRS said we have to replace all of our life safety components this year because the building is 41 years old, and so must collect a large special assessment for it this year. But the fire marshal says everything is working fine and doesn't need to be replaced. Can we dispute this? I would say it's definitely worth asking the questions, you know, without knowing who prepared that or why they came to those conclusions. That's something to look into. If your building is 41 years old and you have original equipment, right? If you've got an original fire alarm system or fire sprinkler system that is not up to code, or they don't have parts for, the fire marshal may come out today and say, look, everything is fine. We can test the system and it passes the test. That's a different question than saying, does it need to be replaced, or will it need to be replaced at any moment now? So if you again remember that the reserve study, and a SIRS is just a type of a reserve study, is for financial planning purposes. You want to understand that you need to have the money set aside before the thing actually fails, right? So then we see this a lot with mechanical systems. They may turn on and off, they may serve their purpose right up until the day that they don't. And as soon as it fails the test, now you need a new one. So it's not this gradual wearing out. It's not like a coat of paint or a roof where it has more of a gradual deterioration cycle. Certain mechanical things may start and then stop, and now you need a new one. So your provider may be saying, look, based on the ages of the equipment here, it is financially prudent for you to be able to replace them in the near future, despite the fact that they may be working today. So again, you know, worth asking the question, worth having that dialogue with the provider. Let's see. Yeah, some of these are just comments in here, so I'm trying to kind of read through those. Yeah, okay, here you go. Reporting requirement was not communicated well. We did our study, but didn't know we had to report to DBPR, so we didn't. Well, part of that was the reporting requirements did not get created at the same time as the requirement to do the study itself. So this wasn't until summer of last year with HB 1021 that they created this requirement. So if you had a SIRS done prior to last summer, right? If you were just an early adopter, let's say you did it in 22 or early 23, I don't know that there was a reporting requirement at that point. So I would say, you know, if that's the case, go ahead and do it now. Better late than never. I don't imagine somebody would penalize the association for not complying with a requirement that didn't exist at the time they had it done. Okay, but it is true now. If you've got your SIRS done, you do need to report that as of now. Okay, more of a philosophical question here. How do you get the board to do the right thing? i.e. the 2025 budget did cover SIRS, but no vote taken on the non-SIRS, and it was not included in the budget. Well, that's breaking the law as far as I know, okay? That it's not up to the board to decide on the behalf of the entire membership whether or not they will fund reserves for things. That the board is obligated to prepare a budget each year that shows the totality of what it would take to fund the reserves. If the membership then petitions the board for an alternate budget, or if the board preempts that and gives them a plan A and a plan B, then the voting process can take place. Okay, but if you did not vote to not fund your reserves, then by default, they are supposed to go into the budget. So that may be a legal question. You know, the board would have to disclose how they prepared the budget and everything that went into that process. But yeah, just to reiterate, if you did not vote, then you should have funded your reserves, even for the non-structural things. Okay, here's a good question. Is it okay that a contract has been signed, but the SIRS has not been completed due to the 2 hurricanes that hit our area within 3 weeks last summer? First of all, I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope everything's getting put back together for you. The board wants to wait until all the hurricane damage repairs are completed. Yes, so going back to what the law says, it says that if a board of directors willfully and knowingly fails to meet the requirement, that's when they're in breach of their fiduciary duty. In your case, I would think that you could say, look, we are not willfully failing to do this. Our property got hit by 2 hurricanes, and we are going through the process of repairing all these things, which would have an immediate effect on the outcome of the SIRS. I don't see anybody, you know, raising any red flags there. So I would just say, document everything you can. If you've got a contract signed, I would say that should be more than enough to satisfy that at the moment. Question here, just any legislative relief on the horizon? I guess depends what you mean by relief. There are some things that we are pushing for in this new round of legislation that I think will help. So first of all, the Senate is considering extension of that deadline. One of the things that I personally and our company is working on is a new way of implementing the financial funding requirement to allow associations to kind of phase in their funding over a couple of years instead of going from 0 to 60 right away. Okay, so right now, when you have a reserve study or a SIRS done, the provider's giving you a number, and kind of the implication is, okay, you have to jump very high right now, and then in years 2 and beyond, you can do a nominal something like 3% annual increase. Our argument is going to be, instead of going from 0 to 60, why don't we phase in these higher contributions over a period of 3 or 4 years and then let it level off once the dust has settled a little bit more. So I would say that that's going to be a form of relief if it can get passed. We'll see. Otherwise, you know, stay tuned. I mean, this is, I'm sure, going to be the subject of a lot of media coverage in the next couple of weeks, and we will see if there's any additional relief or other options that come along. Let's see, can you point to info on what the association is responsible for with regard to maintenance versus the owners? Our docs are not clear. That's a legal question. Yeah, you'd have to talk to your attorney. Your documents may need to be revised to make that clear, because it should be black and white, right? There shouldn't be any ambiguity there. And if you're not sure, talk to an attorney. They can certainly help sort that out for you. All right, let's see, maybe you can go about 10 more minutes. Okay, so let's see, okay. Our reserve report included replacing our drainage plumbing, but not the supply pressurized plumbing, although both have been failing and we have discussed replacing them. Afterwards, the reserve engineer told me that the supply line was not included because it had over a 30-year life. Should he have interpreted the law as over 30 years remaining life? Yeah, so when I went through the list of components that need to be included here, there's two exclusions that are available to the provider. Okay, so when we go through that list of things, there's two reasons why the provider might say that you don't need to fund for something. The first is that if the useful life or the cost of that thing are indeterminate or unpredictable, then you don't actually need to fund for it. The second is if the remaining life is greater than 25 years. Okay, so let's say we're talking about a brand new building. Okay, I go out to a building that opened last year. Their plumbing and their electrical components should last for decades. There should be no concern at all about major projects in the near future. So if that's my client, I'm probably going to say, look, the remaining life here exceeds 25 years. You don't need to fund for this at this time. Now, if I go back to that same building 20 years later, and now my 30-year time horizon is bringing it out to the 50-year mark, maybe now I do start recommending that they fund for plumbing. So, you know, your provider, I would have to look at that study to see what they were doing there. But yes, if the remaining life is greater than 25 years, they could use that as justification to not recommend funding for it. But I think in your case, if you already have concerns that it's failing, then they should have put that in anyways. All right, let's see. Here's a good question. Okay, do you have data on beachfront high rises? The increase in cost is dramatically higher than the statewide data. We do have some additional looks that we've done at this. We did not do one yet that splits out just coastal properties versus others. I did do versions of the analysis where we just looked at Miami-Dade, just Broward, just Palm Beach, at the Tri-County compared to the rest of the state. What we found is that our averages were pretty comparable, as plus or minus 5 to 10% on any of those numbers that I showed when we looked at those subsets. But yes, if you're talking about older high rises on the beach, they are always going to be the most expensive because you have a lot of things that the building is responsible for, a lot of older buildings, and a lot of environmental effects from being right on the sand that will make things not last as long. So I would not be surprised if we did a look at this data that we just looked at beachfront high rises, that maybe the cost of living is higher. I guess all I can say to that is hopefully your property values are also higher, right? You're on a front row seat right on the beach. That carries with it a higher cost of ownership. That's the trade-off, right? If you wanted to move inland to a less expensive property, that's your option. But if you want to live out on the beach and have all the great amenities and all the mechanicals and all the benefits of living on the beach, there is often a higher cost associated with that. And I would say that that has always been true even before this legislation. Okay. Okay, here's a kind of a procedural question. For budgets adopted in 2025, SIRS reserves may not be waived. We adopt budgets in November, December for the following year. So does this mean for our 2026 budget adopted in the fourth quarter of 25? Yes. So December 31st of 2024, a couple months ago, that was the cutoff date. Any budget you adopt from that point forward is subject to this funding requirement. So you cannot waive reserves now for your 2026 budget because you will be finalizing that after December 31st of 24. Okay, let's see. How about balconies and electrical systems? Do they have to be changed all at once? No, not typically, right? So it depends what you mean there. If you're talking about waterproofing of balconies, then I would say you do want to do that to the entire property all at once. If we're talking about allowances for concrete restoration, no, each balcony may be different. You may have one stack of units that has more problems for others, than same goes, I guess, for electrical. You might have allowances for repairs that are necessary in one part of the building, but not elsewhere. So it does not need to be the totality of those things. It's just, the known projects that you have to do at any one point in time. All right, got time for maybe just a couple more. Thank you guys for hanging on. We still have hundreds of people that are here. I appreciate that. I'm going to try to come up with a couple of final questions that are good for the whole group. We've had both a milestone and SIRS completed. Is there a website to check that this has been reported and recorded with the state? Yes. If you go to the DBPR, and I'm sorry, I don't have it memorized, but if you go through the DBPR or maybe just do a Google search, Florida DBPR SIRS reporting database, you should be able to find it pretty quickly. You can log in there, and there's actually a way you can download a list of all the properties that have done it. You can see if your property is already on that list. Let's see. Somebody was asking about a study that we did not see electrical listed in our SIRS or non-SIRS components. Our study was done by Association Reserves. Yeah, we'd have to look at that property, but if your property was relatively new or if there was no cause for concern there, then that's probably why we chose not to include that, again, by virtue of it being either indeterminate or greater than 25 years. But feel free to send me an email. I can look at that one with you, and we'll find out, what was the reason why we excluded electrical components there. Let's see, who pays for the initial SIRS study during developer control? I assume that would be the developer. It's their obligation to do it at the time of turnover as part of that process, so that should be borne by the developer. Okay, a common question here. If there is 12 years remaining on the roof, can insurance make you replace it in 3 years, or they will deny us coverage? Yes, this is something that we've unfortunately been seeing a lot of. Insurance companies, including Citizens, putting a limit on the ages of a roof that they will provide coverage for. So yes, we have had some clients and heard of a lot more properties where your roof is a certain number of years old and they don't really care about its condition. They will say, once it reaches this age, you have to replace it or else we will deny you coverage. So again, that's an unfortunate thing. That's, I think, the result of a lot of hurricanes in the last several years. That have just made insurance companies want to shrink their risk profile, and that's one of the ways they're doing it is just looking at ages of roofs. So talk to your carrier, see if they have any requirement there. If so, then you may need to start funding for that sooner than you would have had to.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.